my usual locations today because, well, we get a lot of interference in this channel, and that's something I really don't want to have to deal with today, because one of the things I wanted to mention in the program today is not really so much about politics right now, although we'll come back to that later in the broadcast, but what has happened since the 1970s to Scotland under the control of both Labour and Conservative governments of various types. Now, what I'm referring to here is just how badly the United Kingdom government managed our resources, because while we were stuck in the Union, and remember in the 1970s nobody ever imagined that Scotland would get anywhere near having a referendum on leaving the Union, and so it was generally accepted that we were kind of stuck with whatever government happened to get elected in England, and of course that's been the case. But what I wanted to talk about was how, first of all, the Labour Party, under the at the time, I believe it was probably Harold Wilson and then Jim Callaghan, dealt with the discovery of oil. Now, Scotland, as you know, has massive oil fields, and it has those fields have been developed massively over the last 4 decades. But in the early stages of the discovery of oil, I don't think anybody in the Labour government in England had any idea just what the effect of that would be, and how it would come to be managed in future years. But what I wanted to point out today really is how various British governments have made really stupid decisions about both oil, gas, and also laterally renewable energy. Now, the first thing I wanted to say about the oil mistakes that were made in the 1970s is something that I lived through as a child. I lived in a village on the Clyde coast, and I grew up by the seaside. And outside my house's front door, virtually, literally 100 metres away, was a shoreline which extended southwards towards what's now the Hunterston Iron Ore Terminal and Hunterston Nuclear Power Station. But back in those days, in 1970-71, the sands that I mentioned earlier extended for about 5 miles south of where we lived, and the beach there was shallow. The sands extended out for over half a mile, and the depth of the water at high tide was perhaps about a metre. You could paddle in it, you could swim in it, and it was safe, apart from the sewage problem, which is something we might return to in another programme. But as things transpired, after the discovery of oil in the 1970s, the Labour government under, I think it was Harold Wilson initially and later Jim Callaghan, decided that they needed a deep water oil terminal. Now, this was at the time designed to import oil from abroad, because nobody really knew how much oil Scotland had at that time. But during the early 70s, there was a collapse in the price of oil. Oil was ridiculously cheap, and the Labour Party, the Labour government of the time, had massive plans to both use that oil, bring it ashore, and even to use it to generate electricity in power stations such as the one which used to exist at Inde-Car further north on the Clyde. However, I digress. So the decision was taken by the Labour government at the time to build a deep water port, basically on the sands, about a mile south of where our house was. And this was going to involve the reclamation of square miles of basically seaside sand, I was going to say sand dunes, basically the shallow water sands that extended out half a mile. And so they started to build this. Now, there were action groups in local villages and towns up and down the coast who bitterly opposed this, because it was going to trash an enormously popular area for tourists and holidaymakers who'd like to come down and camp in the sand dunes and swim in the warm waters. And some of the warm waters were actually being warmed by the cooling water coming out of the nuclear power station, which in those days we thought was perfectly a good idea to swim in it, but perhaps not so much these days. However, the point I'm trying to make here is the Labour Party invested billions in building this oil terminal with this huge pier that extended out along the sands and into the deeper water channel, which faced the southern tip of the island of Cumbrae. And that piece of water, that Deepwater Channel was perhaps only about a mile or maybe less, 3/4 of a mile across. And this is where they were going to bring the oil tankers in, unload the oil and pump it all the way into storage tanks in this oil terminal. But then something unexpected happened. Well, something that the Labour Party didn't expect. And that was there was an oil crisis and the cost of oil spiraled out of control. And all their plans for oil-fired power stations, oil-fired this, that and the other, suddenly didn't look so good. And so they had to think of something else. And the something else they thought of was, well, let's repurpose this deepwater port to bring in iron ore for Scotland's great steelworks. Fantastic idea. So they converted this long pier, instead of having pipework leading from oil tankers to shore-based tanks, they put in a huge conveyor belt system, again at massive infrastructure cost, which was going to basically carry the iron ore, which sort of looks like crushed red rocks, along miles of conveyor belts into huge piles of standing iron ore, which would just simply be dumped in the open air. After a concerted effort by the local people to try and do something about this horrible eyesore that was being built right in front of our eyes on the beach, we actually managed to get the British government at the time to agree to erect artificial hills with forested areas to screen the view of this horrific looking dump of iron ore piles from general view, so that the remaining part of the beach at least would be a bit more attractive to visitors. So that was built. And then something else happened. The government changed, and we had in the late 1970s a swing away from Labour and to the Conservatives. And of course we all know that Margaret Thatcher won that election back in 1979. And that's when things really started to go wrong for Scottish heavy industries, because as we know, Margaret Thatcher's policy at the time was to completely de-industrialise the whole UK, and to that extent she basically closed every heavy industry in Scotland, and what couldn't be just shut down was sold off. Anything that was worth anything was sold into the private sector. And what that meant was the steel industry suddenly vanished. And all of the infrastructure investment the Labour government had made, and potentially some more investment from the Conservative government, basically was wasted. It was thrown away. Billions of pounds in building a deepwater, first of all, oil terminal, and then iron ore terminal, and an oil-fired power station at Inde-Car was trashed. It was money completely squandered in the name of progress, short-term progress, which would return a profit quickly. However, after the whole issue of de-industrialization got into full swing in Thatcher's governments, and also all the way up to John Major's government, after Mrs Thatcher stepped back from it, the damage was done to Scotland. Its heavy industries were basically fatally injured by this, and what was left of them really was a little bit of shipbuilding in the Upper Clyde, and the civilian part of that very quickly collapsed and disappeared, leaving only British orders for warships for the Upper Clyde yards in Govan and Scotstoun, which still remain to this day building warships for the United Kingdom's Navy. But that was all that was left. As well as the steel industry in Scotland, when that disappeared, that took the car industry with it. And the only remaining big car plant, which was at Linwood between Glasgow and Paisley, was basically dumped as well. And this is something else which was completely lost. British Leyland, which under Labour had been a nationalised car manufacturing industry, quickly vanished. And that left Scotland with no car industry, virtually no civilian ship industry, no steel industry. All of the coal mines closed because the blast furnaces which needed coking coal were shut, and then there was a switch over from coal to gas. Somebody in the Tory party realised quite quickly that not only did Scotland have a vast wealth of oil, but it also came with the additional benefit of lots and lots of natural gas coming up, and that's basically methane, something which you can easily use as a heating fuel. And once that was realised, the Tory party had another wheeze, and that was to build up our reliance on methane as the main fuel for people's central heating in Scotland before privatising it to make as much money as possible for private industries out of it, all part of Mrs Thatcher's globalised neoliberal free market economics. But why was that done? Well, that was done so that the government could benefit from selling off these very profitable industries such as the remaining oil industry and the newly formed British Gas, which, as we all know, was called Scottish Gas for a while here, and then just after that it was all promptly sold off. And as you know, prices have been going up and up and up ever since, including electricity, which was also generated by gas-fired power stations. So the switch from oil to gas was complete. The short-termism of the 70s oil boom was over and done with, but yet we still had a lot of oil. And we had a very large amount, and still do have a very large amount, of untapped natural gas. So how has it been mismanaged? Well, the bonanza of gas and the centralised use of it as a heating fuel has basically made it possible for people to have central heating. In the old days, we had coal fires, which of course were really smoky and polluted the atmosphere and were a bit inconvenient. And then there were the far-flung communities of northern Scotland, the Highlands and Islands, which found it difficult to get natural gas, and so ended up using bottled gas or wood-fired heating systems, or basically stoves. And that's remained largely to this day. There are some relatively far-flung communities in Scotland which do receive natural gas now. But as we all know, the prices of gas and electricity have spiralled out of control under a largely soft-touch regulated British energy market, which allows these newly formed corporations to extract huge amounts of money from you and I, basically, just to keep warm and to have enough electricity to keep our lights on. But more importantly, it's stymied the growth of industries in Scotland who also can't afford these massive energy bills either. So we're trapped in this. Now, as we all know, the latest theft or latest mismanagement of Scotland's energy resources is now concentrating its activities on offshore and onshore wind farms, which produce an embarrassingly large surplus of energy in Scotland. So rather than allowing native Scottish companies to get involved in selling that abroad, the British government promptly leapt on that and have decided to invest in Scotland again, but not for our benefit. The idea is they dress this up as the British government heavily investing in Scottish industries, and what they mean is they're going to invest in massive cables which will carry energy not through Scotland from their offshore and onshore wind farms, but under the sea, under the North Sea particularly, and further south to England, to supply much needed electricity, which is obviously renewable and virtually free once you've set up the wind turbines, to England, which is suffering from a massive energy deficit at the moment. Now, England, it has to be said, is very successful in projecting a fantastic image of itself across the world. And because it projects this wonderful image of milk and honey, you know, basically London is a city paved with gold, there's plenty of room for everybody, and that's attracted a huge amount of inward immigration. Now, much of the immigration in England is actually lawful. These are not people coming over in rubber dinghies. These are people who are coming to England to work, who've maybe come from the European Union or America or Canada or Iceland or anywhere else, but they're not coming in rubber dinghies, and they're coming in perfectly legally and being allowed to settle in England. And therefore England has a population problem. There's virtually no square inch of green space in England that hasn't been built over, or flats have been developed on brownfield sites where there used to be industries. So now they've got too many people, not enough energy, and they never invested in their own offshore wind farms, and so they're going to loot ours instead. And so the mismanagement of our energy industries is just one sign of just how much we are a colony. We're basically a cash cow, and we're an enormous cash cow whose lifeblood is a massive amount of energy flowing through its fictional veins and arteries. And so what England is doing is attaching, well, let's call them figurative leeches to these blood vessels and sucking out whatever they feel like in order to nurture their own communities further south. And we know this is happening. It's obvious it's happening because they put up posts of these lovely diagrams of all these huge gas pipelines, oil pipelines, and now electricity subsea cables, just linking directly from Scotland's energy fields straight to England. Not a penny of this comes back to the Scottish Treasury, unless it's very indirectly via the so-called Barnett consequentials, which is another issue I'll talk about another time, but basically means that Scotland gets precisely 8% of bugger all. And in the case of energy, it gets 8% of nothing, maybe even minus 8%. It really gets nothing back for all the energy that is being hoovered out of our offshore energy firms. But not only that, but the profits taken by the energy companies, particularly Scottish Power, which is not Scottish, but is actually owned by Iberdrola, which is a Spanish energy conglomerate. So this Spanish corporation is making vast profits from our resources, and then it's selling them back to us, but also selling them to all these poor English people who are taking our energy from our energy fields because they don't have their own. They're certainly not developed enough to nurture the market that England has generated for itself. So by the mismanagement of migration into England, the mismanagement and the theft of Scotland's natural resources, all of the potential bonanza that the oil and gas and renewables industries have given Scotland are basically being stolen and squandered. The money is going up in literally a puff of smoke, or maybe just a little flash of blue flame, or perhaps a spark of electricity, but all the same, it's vanishing and we'll never see it again. That brings me to the present and future for Scotland, and as you know, I favour Scotland leaving the Union. But what should the new Scottish Government do if we leave the Union? How should we manage the resources that we still have? Now, one of the things that's most difficult to do is to renationalise something that's already in private hands. And so instead of attempting the impossible and coming up with billions of pounds worth of basically buying power to buy back what really is already ours, but is in the hands of private multinationals like Iberdrola, is simply to come up with a way of splitting the energy which Scotland requires for its daily usage and for the growth and expansion of its industries away from what is already being siphoned off and basically transported to England. And I've mentioned this in previous shows that I've done, but I've never really thought that much about how a new Scottish government should behave. One of the first things I think we need to do is, once Scotland is actually independent again and has regained the levers of power over all of its resources, is to elect a government which is, although it's there maybe just for a short term, maybe up to 5 years, whatever, that there ought to be some legislation put in place which compels any Scottish government that is elected to take a 25-year view of their plans for particularly our energy resources, because that's what it takes to plan ahead. And this is why both Labour and Tory have failed dramatically to manage the resources which they had whilst we were in the Union in the 70s and have wasted. We can do so much better than that. So what I would like to say is that as soon as the Scottish Government is able to do it, that they should form a national energy corporation. Now, that energy corporation is not going to generate all the electricity or the gas or the oil, whatever else, but what it will do is do a very advantageous deal with the existing private companies who harvest these resources from the North Sea and elsewhere. And that would be simply, the deal would be, we would want all of our natural resources which are used by our internal economy, that is businesses, people, that would naturally be families and households, to be at cost. In other words, to supply that energy for the price it costs to produce it and transport it to us. And that price would be far lower than it is now, and we would all be able to afford it. And that would have to be guaranteed for the next 25 years. In exchange for giving us that, or agreeing to that, we would license all those corporations which are exporting our energy elsewhere, primarily to England, let us say, to be allowed to do that freely and to charge what they want for it on condition that we get a small royalty on every litre of oil, every cubic metre of gas, and every kilowatt hour of electricity which flows from our resource centres, the places where they're produced, south of the border to England or elsewhere. In other words, what we're looking for is two things: a guaranteed low price for our domestic supplies, and in exchange for that, the freedom to export to whomever they want on condition that we get a small royalty revenue on each unit sold. Now that is a perfectly legitimate commercial deal to do. It can't be done by a government though, it needs to be done by a third party, and that's why I'm suggesting that we have this, shall we say, quango, a quasi non-government organisation, basically a business which has been set up to handle such agreements and licenses and is authorised by the Scottish Government to do so on a 25-year timescale. So all of these licenses would be for 25 years, like a mortgage basically. That would ensure that Scotland's energy security was completely in place for at least the next 2.5 decades. This would not be, incidentally, contingent on a particular party winning an election after 25 years, because that new agreement would come back into play again on a rolling basis, but with some modifications necessary for changes in the market at that time. And that's essential anyway, to have the ability to alter the terms slightly to accommodate fluctuations in the prices of the commodities we're exporting. That requires the government to take a hands-off approach. Once it has set this up, it needs to be set up with people who are already in these industries and understand them really well, in order to prevent any further looting of the resources and to make sure that the profits flow back into the Scottish Treasury. Once that is done, we can then look at dispersing what is made from these profits and these licenses, and use that for the benefit of the people who live here, the ones who are already Scottish and are trying to expand their businesses and create new ones. And that means having an investment bank, which we already have. The Scottish National Investment Bank already exists, but have it repurposed and flush with cash from these ongoing royalties and from the license fees that have already been agreed. And because the energy cost is flatline for the next 25 years, all of the companies operating in Scotland will be free to expand their businesses, hire more people, and to expand their facilities based on what is allowable under the local planning rules. Now, as well as this, we also need to have a fairly tight migration and immigration policy, which looks at the needs of the country and prioritises people with the correct skills. I'm not suggesting that we should shut everybody out who doesn't fit that, but there ought to be two channels for migration into Scotland. Those who wish to come here for social reasons because they want to live here and be Scottish and take their part or play their part in the internal economics and politics of Scotland, but who are not particularly planning to open a business or to expand a business that's already there. There ought to be, as I say, two channels. So all of this is something which can be planned ahead for, and this is also something which any political party in Scotland which is looking for election next year might want to think about, because one of the things that everybody hates about having to fight so hard for independence is having a vision of what the new country will look like. And until actually people understand what the new country should look like and what legislation will be put in place once we have left the Union, we then have to fight even harder, because it's difficult to convince people of what will happen. Now, the other big question for a new administration and a newly liberated Scotland, one which has come back to its roots and has its own government again, its own powers again, is that many people are worried about what our relationship would be with our English neighbours, perhaps our Welsh neighbours, Irish neighbours, and so on. There's no reason at all why an incoming government cannot set up new legislation and come to new agreements with both England, Wales and Northern Ireland, which suit those countries' individual needs for the particular commodities which Scotland has surpluses of. In other words, we can do deals with each individual country. And I'm suggesting here actually that even if England and Wales are still technically in the UK, and maybe Northern Ireland too, that Scotland does deals with the independent parliaments of Wales and Northern Ireland as well, so that people there get the benefit of a different deal from that which we might say offer to England, which is far larger and has a bigger population. It maybe has slightly more buying power, but all of these things can be accommodated because people in Scotland know that Wales has a smaller population than Scotland, not much, but about 3 million people. But Wales sadly had all of its coal mines shut. It has a fishing industry, and I believe there will be, or there already is, some wind farm activity off the west coast of Wales, and I'm sure that would increase with time. And it would be nice if Scotland, as a newly independent state, one which has got back its powers, was able to do deals which helped both Northern Ireland and Wales to bring them up to the kind of standard of living and the the security that they have within their country to live and work without fear of poverty, so that they are at least on par with us. England is always going to have a higher standard of living simply because of the concentration of wealth there. But now the concentration of wealth in England is going to have to come from England itself. And that means England needs to start investing in its own industries and not relying on the surpluses that it drags out of the Scottish system virtually for free. All of these things, I think, once you think about this, you can begin to see a picture of what the new Scotland would look like. And this is one of the things which I feel very strongly about and have done since the 1970s. When I was very much younger, I think I must have been about 15 or 16, I wrote a lengthy paper on the potential for Scotland's tidal energy system. But in the 70s, I knew that a massive computer system would be necessary to regulate it, and that didn't exist back then. But I postulated a system where it would exist in the future, where all the wind farms and all the tidal energy turbine sites could be linked together in a massive power generating system, which was controlled by one large intelligent computer, which could switch on and off these devices as the need for those resources changed over time. And I still believe that that's something that our Scottish government can and should develop once we have liberated ourselves from British control. And it's something I think would form the backbone of the Scottish economy. And remember, we have lots of other things that we can export, as well as the energy resources I've mentioned. Whisky is obviously a big one, but we also have a massive tourism industry. And having another department which is predominantly tasked with rewilding our wild places and restoring the ancient Scottish pine forests, for example, and ensuring that the wildlife in Scotland recovers to the point where people who visit, especially rural Scotland and the mountains, lochs and the islands, get a chance to see this, because it is a big draw. And it would mean that as long as the tourism industry is properly managed, and this is again has to be under the purview of some kind of agency which knows what the local areas and local people need and want from their tourist industry, so that it doesn't clash with the way of life of islanders, fishermen, crofters, and any other rural businesses and communities which might be affected by far too much traffic, for example, coming through on the narrow streets. All of these things can and should be done. But Scotland has a wonderful future ahead of it. And the only reason that we don't have it is because no one yet has had the imagination to start thinking about it. And this is my first attempt to try and communicate all of this to you as a sort of grand plan. There will be more such programs where I try to explain how we can manage other resources, how we can develop our internal economy much more fully so that it's stable and gradually growing, but without ruining the environment in the process. And also, as a part of that business model, rewilding areas and protecting and encouraging the wildlife to recover. In that way, we have an industry which is dedicated to making money. That would be our energy industry. And with that money, we can make sure that nobody is poor. We can support single parent families. We can ensure that children don't slide into poverty. We can improve and rebuild housing stock, which is crumbling at the moment, especially in the social sector. We can do all of those things, but they cannot be done while neoliberal politicians like Keir Starmer are busy trashing everything that was potentially good about previous ideas, about managing the economy better, encouraging growth in the right areas, and protecting, and not just protecting, but enlarging the wild spaces of Scotland and in some places in Northern England as well, and Wales. So it can be done, should be done. All it takes is a bit of imagination and somebody in Parliament, and I'm talking about leaders of parties here, with the imagination to start looking for people who have these ideas and bringing them in as special advisors, so that those politicians have the right plans in place, and so that the parties in government in the future Scotland can take the right sort of action. Anyway, that's it from Inde-Car today. I'm sorry, it's a rather complex and nerdy kind of broadcast, but I think it's important that we all try to understand the bigger picture here, and that we don't just look at the petty politics of point-scoring politicians and any, I would say, side issues that are really not important to the big ticket items that I've just mentioned for the entire future of the country going forward in stages of 25 years at a time. Anyway, that's it from Inde-Car today. I hope you enjoyed the broadcast. If you did, please press the like button, subscribe to the channel for more content like this. It drives the algorithm, makes this a more popular program on YouTube. And if you can afford to, please use the link to make a donation to help me keep these broadcasts coming to you on a more regular basis. I'll see you soon, but in the meantime, as I always say, keep the faith. The future is bright, but we need the politicians to start listening to the people with ideas. See you soon. Bye for now.